Thanks for joining me. I'm Austin Childress, a solution engineer with Tulip. I've spent the last 10 years of my career designing, building, and implementing software solutions for a variety of regulated industries, including life sciences, oil and gas, and general manufacturing. At Tulip, my role is to consult our customers on their digital transformation goals and help teach them to build solutions that accomplish these goals. I've seen many teams deploy incredible projects using Tulip, and also some who have struggled to get started. My goal today is to share some of my experience designing and executing projects to help you become more successful using our platform to drive your own digital transformation. To set the stage for today's discussion, I'm going to share a short story about Company A and Company B. These are two real companies and two real projects that I've worked on in the past. Both companies have a similar use case, EBR, and they both want to digitally transform their operations, but each company approached the projects a little bit differently. Company A chose to start with a small initial scope, and they dedicated both plant and corporate resources to the project. With guidance from Tulip, their app builders led the project and worked with their internal teams to get the required feedback for the apps along the way. Company B wanted a product fast, with little involvement from their own resources, understandable because they had the plant to run. They chose a turnkey approach with a larger scope in order to quickly transform operations for an entire product line. This project was led by Tulip, with input and feedback gathered at regular intervals from the client. We'll come back to both these cases, so keep these approaches just in the front of your mind as we talk through the next few sections. In today's session, we'll first look at some solution design best practices to get you thinking about how Tulip can digitally transform your business. Next, I'll make some recommendations for how you can implement Tulip most effectively during the project lifecycle. Then we'll look at a few examples of the most common mistakes or pitfalls that I've encountered on customer projects. So to begin, I just want to ask a question. Where is everyone at in their digital transformation journey? On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being you haven't started and all your processes are performed on paper. 2, you have a blend of paper and digital, but maybe you're still using things like Excel spreadsheets to get things done on the day-to-day. 3, you're completely paperless and you're comfortable with digital solutions. 4, you have a unified tech stack and maybe you've even integrated some of these software solutions together. 5, you're using predictive capabilities like AI in your businesses. Most of our customers are somewhere between 1 and 3. If this is where you are, then today's content should be especially useful and relevant. First, we're going to talk about solution design. Whether you're Company A or Company B, it can feel very overwhelming to look at an existing paper process and think about how to digitize it. Here's my advice. Focus on these 3 things initially. Number 1, involve the right stakeholders. This means getting the people involved to actually run the process and will be using Tulip, and you want these people in the project as early as possible. Your operators probably know the process better than anyone else in the facility, so why not put that expert knowledge to good use? This is critical to success in any Tulip deployment, and I've really never seen an exception. Number 2 goes hand in hand with number 1, which is follow the operator. And what I mean by this is follow the operator through the process. We recommend breaking the use case apart into both physical and operational aspects. To build apps, we need to consider both what is being done and where it's being done in order to build the most effective solution. For example, most batch records have a list for materials and equipment on the very first page. But in practice, those equipment and materials used get recorded ad hoc as the batch is being made. So if you were to build that process in the digital world and you tried to mimic what was on paper, you probably wouldn't build the most useful application on the first try. So it's really important to know when and where your activities occur so we can understand how to correctly build apps around those things. Number 3 is to start small and iterate. Too much scope early on can quickly derail a project, especially if it's your first experience with new technology. We recommend taking an MVP approach. Define what the minimum viable product looks like and focus on deploying that first to maximize your ROI. For example, if eliminating human errors in your record is a primary goal, then don't try to tackle the entire production process all at once. Instead, let's start with something more simple, like just cleaning logs. This will allow you to build a backbone, and once this is deployed, it becomes much easier to build on the structure that exists. This slide illustrates the broad digitalization journey for most customers. For organizations that are less digitally mature, we want to maximize the return on our invested time and resources. And we also understand that Tulip is new and disruptive. So this is why we recommend starting small and incrementally building your way from left to right across this diagram. Digitalization does take time, but that doesn't mean you always have to wait for value. A small focused solution is the best way to deliver value as quickly as possible. Over time, we want to see our customers move incrementally from the left to the right. This will happen not really in months, but probably in years. With a series of focused incremental improvements, you can achieve digital transformation on a large scale. And I love diagrams, so my next slide is also a diagram. But this is a Tulip concept that I want to share, going back to solution design a little bit. This is called the operational flow diagram. It's a visual representation of a Tulip solution from about a 20,000 foot view. So let's break it apart a little bit. At the very top, we've got all of our third-party software, things we want to integrate with, things like SAP or your QMS, maybe your LIMS system, or even process control if it has the capability. We want to define those things early so we can understand, what is in our ecosystem when it comes to building the solution. The next thing we'll consider is the apps themselves, which is kind of the blue layer there. Remember, an app is built around a person, and that person is performing a task. So the bulk of our diagram here is actually outlining what that task is, and then we're going to build an app that represents the tasks that need to be performed through the lens of the person who's performing them. We need to know what's being done, where it's being done, and by extension, who it's being done by. So this means your digital solution will actually begin to look like a series of apps or a suite of apps that all work together. Building an OFD is the best way to visualize the transformation as we convert a piece of paper to a digital solution. And you may be surprised at what you find after you build the OFD. One example I like to use here is sampling. So on paper, your batch record might have a take a sample step, and it might be in your record 5 or 6 times, maybe more. Sampling is really a separate activity. So if you were to build one large EBR app that represented all the steps in your paper process, you would end up repeating that step 6 or 7 times, right? In Tulip, it might actually be better and more useful to break that sampling process apart. Sampling can stand alone as an app by itself. If product A has a special sampling procedure, we can build that customization into the sampling app. If product B requires something differently, then we rinse and repeat. But the point I'm trying to make is that the digital world doesn't always look like the paper world. Your products can be customized as needed, and that's really the unique value that Tulip brings. Next, we're going to talk about implementation. After we have the initial solution design in place, it's important to think about scalability early in the project. One way to do this is to build templates. During implementation, we'll build in lots of specific functionality that might become useful in other places. Think things like work instruction steps, or data inputs, or timer steps. Standardizing the look and feel of these elements will give your end users a very cohesive experience. Tulip also has a new feature called the App Exchange that allows you to share apps at the enterprise level across different sites and instances of Tulip. So this is a great way to establish consistency. You can use the App Exchange to share common template apps, or a shared base layout, or starter steps to help your new app builders get started. We know that a blank slide can be intimidating, so leaning on the App Exchange is intended to make this easier. The second thing to focus on during implementation is testing. Test as often as possible. You can never test early enough. I mean it. Tulip is extremely agile, which means that you can develop and test in parallel. During any given Tulip project, I would say plan for at least 3 breaks during development to perform focused end user testing. Really focus on edge cases during these periods, because that's where you can spend probably the most time implementing, or maybe you lose the most time during implementation because you didn't consider the edge cases until this stage of the project. But again, remember, Tulip is a low-code, no-code platform, so your end users can contribute directly to finding these edge cases. When end users are able to contribute their process knowledge to the solution before it's released or accepted, there's a dramatic impact on the project timeline and the overall value of the solution. The other thing to stay focused on during implementation, just like in solution design, is the concept of MVP. When you're implementing Tulip, it's very easy to get excited, and maybe you want to add scope. You know, light bulb moments go off when you're in the editor and you're building steps, and that's great. We want to channel that enthusiasm into the right places, but it's important to stay grounded by those MVP criteria. So every time you have a new idea during implementation, I would encourage you to maybe log it somewhere, triage it, but don't let it slow you down from building that MVP app that you're really focused on, right? We want to deploy focused solutions that make sense and add value, but it's really easy to get lost in the possibilities of Tulip during implementation. So don't let the scope creep. Stay focused on what the MVP requirements are. My next slide is just illustrating the agile methodology. This is just to help you visualize best practice 2 and 3 of implementation. But this is really where citizen development becomes extremely, extremely important. If you look at this timeline, this timeline can be shortened just by embracing low code, no code, and putting your operations team in the driver's seat. At Tulip, we can teach you how to Tulip a lot quicker than you can teach us how your process works. And I really, really want to highlight this because I've seen solutions fall apart just due to low engagement or low understanding of the technical aspects. If your operations team is afraid of the tools, they're never going to use them, right? But Tulip is not nearly as complex as SAP or as these other enterprise software that maybe people are used to working with. So it's really important for every member of your project team to get comfortable, really lean into the toolbox that we're providing. Get everyone using the editor. Everyone should be running apps in the player. Everyone should be testing apps at a minimum, because when everyone can use these tools that are at your disposal, your team will begin to think differently, and you'll start to create solutions that exceed the limits of what paper can do, and maybe even go beyond what your team thought they were capable of doing. This is how a citizen developer is created. And this unlock, which is empowering citizen developers, is unique to Tulip and is critical to realizing value. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the most common mistakes that I've encountered while consulting customers. Probably the most common mistake we see is trying to recreate paper in the digital world. And we see this all the time, right? Customers take their checklist or paper artifact and they attempt to recreate an exact copy in Tulip. Don't feel bad if you've tried doing this. Almost everyone does at some point or another. And on the surface, it seems harmless, but there are actually several really good reasons why you should never do this. One of those reasons is the data structure. This ties in nicely with mistake number 2, which is overly complex data models. So what happens after you build that checklist is usually we'll see a Tulip table get created, and then all of that collected data from the existing paper process goes into a column in a Tulip table. And that's what my screenshot here is illustrating. This is a real table from a real customer that we were working with. Initially we got them on the right track, but trying to stuff all of that data using triggers into a Tulip table is an absolutely exhausting exercise. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of triggers to fully populate a record when you do it this way. Instead, there's actually a scalable data capture mechanism that's built into the Tulip platform on purpose. This is called a completion record. And we'd really like to see more customers lean into this method of data capture. A completion record meets all the principles of Alcoa. It's immutable. And best of all, it can be performed just using one simple trigger in the platform. You could put that trigger on the base layout and you could literally only write it once. And that would make sure that every single piece of data in your app is captured. So yeah, that's going to be a lot more efficient than trying to stuff your information into Tulip tables. The completion record is a digital footprint of your app's execution. So completion records are built around apps, or it's through the lens of an application, and it collects all the metadata that you need. We've got the station, the time they spent on the step, the logged in user, along with all of your record placeholders and all the values of every variable in your app at the time the completion record is taken. So this is the real way to capture digital data. Let's move on to the third mistake, which you guessed it, non-embracing citizen development. We really, really want to see more customers embrace citizen development. Putting a tool like Tulip in the hands of your operations team is extremely powerful. Every company out there has a digital process in place right now that isn't well suited for what it's being used to do. And software has also just been around long enough that it's becoming outdated every day. I know everyone in operations has probably experienced the common scenario where a solution gets identified at a very high level and that it's quickly deployed without feedback or input from the end users. Once it's in place, your team hates it. It can't be changed easily because maybe it requires code or a specialized resource. So your team's stuck with it for the long term, and it's going to end up impacting your efficiency and over time your morale. My goal is to make sure that Tulip never gets deployed that way. And one of the biggest value adds that Tulip brings is this enablement to the end user. Citizen development closes the gap between the end user and the scary tech world. It allows your citizen developers to build better apps knowing that they will also be the end users. So now let's circle back to the case study. It should be pretty obvious at this point what the results will likely be, but let's take a look. So company A deployed their POV in 3 months. Once they had gathered feedback from the end users, they used the POV to build templates, and they were ready to scale at the end of the project. What about company B? Remember, we had considerably more scope with company B, but they did miss their deadline. And the main reason for this was because of the amount of rework that we had to do. So we didn't get feedback from the end users nearly as frequently as we would have liked to. And so at the end, we had just end users kind of adjacent to the process. We weren't maybe building in a vacuum, but it was pretty close to that. So what they got at the end of the project was vastly different from what they actually needed. And then we had to waste time and effort to refine what we had built to align it with the end user's expectations. So it's just really, really, really important to have your audience in mind. Just like when you make a presentation, when you build an app, you need to know who's going to use the app and what are their needs so you can tailor the app to those specific things. So let's think about what we learned from today's session. Big lesson number 1, involve the right stakeholders early. Company A had site leadership, corporate governance, and end users all involved in the project early and often. Leaving any of these groups out will have an impact on your project success. Big lesson number 2, the project will always take longer without end user input to design and implementation. If an app gets built in a vacuum, you will likely end up reworking them prior to development. So embrace citizen development. This is an organizational superpower, which is enabled by Tulip. Big lesson number 3, start small, deploy, then iterate. Focused solutions add more value, and another unique benefit of the Tulip platform is how easy it is to make changes later on. In this way, you can successfully scale up your solutions to handle even the largest business challenges. I hope you found today's session helpful. Thanks for listening, and happy app building.